Christian Filipinos make up the majority of the country's population. But to say that the Philippines is a Catholic country belies and betrays the realities and the history of the nation. Prior to Christianity reaching Philippine shores in the 16th century, Islam has already begun its slow but steady spread from Mindanao. But while the Moros were able to resist Spanish colonization, several events in the 20th century form part of the Muslim Filipinos' grievances against Imperial Manila. In this episode of Contested Philippine Histories, we scan several historical periods and situate Moro identity as we ask, what is the Moros' place in our history? Hi, I am Lee Candelaria.
I am Aaron Malyari.
And I am Vecal Porja.
And this is Podcast, Conversations in Philippine History, Politics, and Society. Kung last week pinag-usapan natin ang kababaihan sa kasaysayan, ngayon dumako naman tayo sa isa na namang bahagi ng bansa na naisantabi, naisagilid, or probably it's more apt to say na isinantabi at isinagilid, ano? And this is no other than Filipino Muslims or Moros.
Pero bakit nga ba Moro ang tawag natin sa mga Pilipinong Muslim? Siguro dito natin simulan yung discussion because maybe it's not really clear for many kung bakit ganon.
True. For the longest time kasi, ang tingin dun sa term na Moro, diba, it carried somehow a negative connotation. So, kung uugatin natin yung pinanggalingan ng pangalang yan, kailangan nating mag-travel back several hundred years ago. No? So, sa Espanya, particularly nung 8th century hanggang 15th century, nung mga panahong ito, Spain was occupied by Muslims who the Christian Europeans called the Moors. No? So, bakit Moors ang tawag nila? Nanggaling yan dun sa bansag na Maori, M-A-U-R-I, hindi yung Maori na M-A-O-R-I. Noong classical period sa Berber tribes. The same name was adopted in Latin and later in the Middle Ages, ginamit na rin sa Roman languages. No? So, it became Moro in Spanish. So, anyway, back to our story. So, the Spaniards fought the Moors and it was dubbed as the Reconquista or yung reconquest ng Iberian Peninsula. Dahil nga nung nag-unite yung Castile at Aragon, they wanted to drive out the Moors out of the Iberian Peninsula. No? So, the idea was they were taking back 8 centuries, diba? So, kaya Reconquista. No? So, they were taking back their lands and within the centuries na na-occupied, and they believed na syempre yung mga lupa na to sa Iberian Peninsula are rightfully theirs. No? So, napakahabang process nun at may paglaban na ginawa ang Spain at ang Portugal para ma-recapture yung teritoryo na sinakop ng mga Moors or ng mga Moro.
So ayun, nabawi naman nila paunti-unti kasi nga 800 taon yon, 800 taon silang lumaban. And by the next century, the 16th century or 1500s, to the Spaniards' surprise, meron ulit silang madadatnan na mga Muslim. And this time, sa Asia naman, particular na sa Pilipinas. And Spain had this, usual white man complex, white European complex, na pinapangalanan nila yung mga taong kinocolonize nila. So they called people from Luzon and the Visayas Indios, samantalang tinawag nilang mga Moro ang mga Muslim sa Mindanao.
But it was a misappropriation kasi they are not the same people technically. They are no different from the rest of the inhabitants in what would become the Philippines. But by virtue of their faith, they were already marked by the Spaniards. Again, this is the braggadocio of the Spaniards sa tipong nagsisimula lang kayong mag-exist when we named you guys. But Islam has been in the Philippines, in the archipelago, since the 14th century and even earlier in Southeast Asia. These Moros were inhabitants of the Philippines who came from its many ethno-linguistic groups but chose to embrace the Islamic faith. At hindi lang sa Mindanao may Muslim, kahit sa Luzon. In fact, sabi ng Spanish historian na si Jose Montero y Vidal, and I quote, "So well-rooted was the cancer that had the arrival of the Spaniards been delayed, all the people would have become Moors, as are all the islanders who have not come under the government of the Philippines." End of quote.
Grabe, no? Cancer yung term na ginamit, no? So, pero anyway, madalas laging tanong yan, di ba? Na parang, paano kaya kung hindi dumating ang mga Espanyol, di ba? So, according to that quote by Montero y Vidal, malamang daw, Muslim na ang buong kapuluan ng magiging Pilipinas. So, ang sabi naman nating mga historiador, syempre, we wouldn't really know kasi hindi nga nangyari.
True, that's, counterfactual conditional. Kumbaga, walang sense yun, walang sense na alamin kasi wala naman tayong paraan para malaman kung ano talaga ang maaaring mangyari kasi hindi naman nangyari. And I think some people ask that and then would exclaim na, naku, buti na lang na-colonize tayo kasi kung hindi, baka Muslim na pala ako ngayon. Like, hello, Jemerlin, check your discriminatory tendencies,
Oo nga, ito talagang si Jemerlin. Anyway, ayun na nga. The Spaniards equated being Muslim to being Moro. And in doing so, supplanted their own biases and hate against a group of people they fought for 8 centuries. So, deep-seated hate itong nailipat sa mga Muslim kasi ang tingin sa kanila ay warlike, barbarians, uncivilized. In fact, isang Spanish historian ulit, si Murillo Velarde, ang sabi niya, ang mga Muslim daw sa Mindanao ay, and I quote, tenacious in their errors, unfaithful to their words, traitors to their dealings, discriminating with regard to what is convenient to them, and fearless in war. End of quote.
And that description says a lot about how the Spaniards pitted the Christianized Indio against the Moro. I mean, hindi tulad ng mga Amerikano, medyo mas naging systematic kasi yung mga Amerikano in dealing with the Muslims from Mindanao.
Ayan, nabanggit na ang Estados Unidos. If the Spaniards saw the Moros as the people they fought during the Reconquista, the Americans saw the Moros as the Apaches of the Philippines. Kumbaga, Native American Indians naman, na somehow ay kinalaban din ng white American settlers. The Moros naturally opposed the Americans at mas nahirapan ng mga Amerikano na talunin ng mga Moro. To the point na kung sa ibang bahagi ng Pilipinas, civil government na under the Americans, sa Mindanao, military government ang namayani.
And the policy of the Americans was to treat the Moros like their American Indians after their defeat. Kumbaga, kahit na they handled them with force and might, they also applied the policy of attraction and pacification through non-military means, especially through opening schools. No? So, the goal was to integrate, quote-unquote, integrate the Moros into the Philippines, into the The goal was to integrate, quote-unquote, the Moros into the Philippine body politic.
It was also the Americans who started the resettlement of Mindanao. Siyempre, mas malaki ang population ng Luzon at Visayas, so when agricultural colonies were established in Mindanao, with it came Christian settlers. But the majority of the agricultural colonies were under the Americans. In fact, super interested ng American investors to remain in the island at some point. They wanted to totally exclude Mindanao from the rest of the Philippines and keep it under American military control. Interestingly, many of the Moro elite also wanted to remain under the American control and protection. In fact, tinawag pa nila ang sarili nilang mga Americanistas. And obviously, they were supported by sympathetic American business owners. Meanwhile, there were also Muslims who wanted to drive away the Americans, and they were called Filipinistas.
And that was such an interesting dynamic, ano? Sabi nga ni Federico Magdalena sa artikulong Moro-American Relations in the Philippines, there were 3 groups: the Moros, the Christians, and the Americans. These groups are interlinked by friendliness and hostility. So long story short, the Americans transformed Mindanao, made it more secular. But at the same time, it also fueled a slowly growing feeling of injustice, especially as the resettlers from the rest of the Philippines come pouring into Mindanao.
At narito na nga tayo. After World War II, it was particularly under the term of Presidents Quirino and Magsaysay when the resettlement program reached a fever pitch. No? So, in fact, under Magsaysay, ginamit pang-attract sa mga hooks na sumuko sa pamahalaan na they will be given lands in Mindanao. No? Diba? Dito din natin maririnig yung tawag sa Mindanao na lupang pangako. Diba? Yung land of promise. Diba? May kanta yung asin dyan. No? So, dahil na rin sa mga programa ng pamahalaan.
And Moros would now feel stronger than ever that they are being driven out of their homeland. In the late 1950s, magisimula yung mga episodes of violence between the Christian resettlers and the Muslims, and it's always about land. Hanggang sa, yun na nga, Marcos happened in the 1960s, the Jabida Massacre happened in 1968, and the Moro political awakening sprung to life.
At dito na nga mabuhay ang Moro National Liberation Front or MNLF, who started the positive appropriation of the term Moro and added it to the Islamic concept of the Ummah or the community, which was encapsulated naman in the term Bangsa. So, Bangsamoro. Maganda sanang ituloy na yung usapan tungkol sa MNLF at MILF, pero I believe we will have a separate episode for that. So, abangan nyo yan. Pero ayun na nga, long story short, the MNLF will fight the government hanggang 1996, when they will sign a peace treaty with the government. The MILF, on the other hand, or the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, a splinter group of the MNLF, wasn't so happy with the peace treaty. So they decided to continue the fight against the government, and they will sign a peace treaty with the government naman noong 2014. And in 2018, the Bangsamoro Organic Law was signed, and the Bangsamoro was born, which replaced the Autonomous Region of Muslim Mindanao or ARMM. Short version yan, pero I think na-capture yung major milestones ng Mindanao Independence Movement.
Pero balik tayo ng kaunti. So noong 1970s, may mga Moro guerrillas who were fighting the government. So the Philippine Constabulary were fighting the insurgents, and through the encouragement of then President Ferdinand Marcos, a group of Ilonggos banded together to form a militia. They called themselves Ilaga, which is Visayan for rat or daga. Very interesting itong Ilaga kasi it became a Christian extremist paramilitary group. They were very brutal to their victims, and they targeted Muslims talaga. They entered Moro communities at night, burning houses as the families slept, killing all of them as they ran out of their homes. And then there's the Manini Massacre in North Cotabato noong June 19, 1971. Ang nangyari naman dito, inimbitahan yung lahat ng Muslim sa buong bayan ng Manili para sa peace talks daw with Christian groups. That time, all the men were already in the fields. So ang naiwan lang sa bayan ay mga kababaihan, mga nanay at mga anak nila at yung mga matatanda. So they were forced into the school, an elementary school, and the masjid. And then the Philippine Constabulary and the Ilagas opened fire on the elementary school. Tapos sa masjid, they threw grenades. It was such a gruesome scene according to eyewitnesses, and the Ilaga, being a ritualistic folk Catholic group who believed in amulets or anting-anting, started cutting off the ears of the victims kasi protection daw nila yun.
Oh my God, sobrang lala.
Diba? What a terrible episode in the history of Mindanao. And I would argue the Philippines in general. Diba? No? So, and we can't deny how Marcos played a role in this. Malinaw naman. Diba?
Ang naiisip ko when I read about this gruesome chapter of Philippine history, how unfair we have been against our fellow Filipinos. And kahit tayong millennials, growing up, internalizing the hatred of Muslims from our parents maybe, or the people around us, which, you would realize na wala naman talagang batayan. Like, I remember, ang tingin ko sa Muslim talaga noong bata ako ay Abu Sayyaf, MILF, Jamaah Islamiyah,
Taliban, Al-Qaeda, o nga no, parang we grew up or at least nagkaroon tayo ng muwang sa daigdig na mainstream ang bias judgment against Muslims.
Yeah, I'm happy that we are slowly but surely realizing that the path to peace in Mindanao is quite on track, and we can trace that from the headway we made in 2014 during Pinoy's term as president. And now, the Bangsamoro government is under transition. Ibig sabihin, lesser news na about the war in Mindanao. So, the Muslims won't be painted as violent, warlike. Kasi yan yung very prominent na pagbabalita tungkol sa Mindanao, I think, nung mas bata tayo.
And I think this episode tells us na ilang daang taon na rin pala na ganyan ang tingin sa mga Muslim. We may have come a long way, but I dare say, it is not enough. We can do a lot better.
And maybe we can contribute by looking back, diba? Understanding the dynamics of Philippine society, and we can do that by knowing more about our history.
Right. We'll do more of that in the next episode when we talk about the Chinese and Philippine history. For now, we invite everyone listening to follow or subscribe to our social media accounts for more updates on the show. You can also find our episodes on YouTube. Just search for Podcast TV.
Or check us out anywhere you listen to podcasts, so Apple, Google, Spotify, and a lot more. You can also visit our website, podcast.org, for more resources on Philippine history, politics, and society.
So that's it for now. Kita-kita tayo sa susunod na episode. See you and have a good day.